Since I started making videos on YouTube, I've been pretty good at keeping a set schedule for video topics. At any time, I usually know what the next 3 or 4 video topics will be, and I start laying a lot of the groundwork in advance to stick to this schedule. But really recently, I saw a short OVA series that basically made me throw this schedule out the window because I just had to talk about it. Rurouni Kenshin, Trust and Betrayal. This story is a prequel to the more shonen-esque Rurouni Kenshin series proper, which I haven't actually seen. But before I watched, I made sure with experts on the series that watching this prequel before the main series was okay. I had been meaning to watch it, as a few subscribers had recommended it to me, saying that I'd really like it. So one night, I decided to watch the whole thing, and it proceeded to captivate me. Please note that this video has what some may consider minor spoilers about the style of story, some tools used throughout, and the type of man that the main character is. But for some people who haven't seen Trust and Betrayal, this video can be used as a review to help conclude whether or not this story is something that you'd be interested in. I'll admit right off the bat that my assessment of Trust and Betrayal is not completely objective. This is because it is absolutely my type of show, and that may mean that I enjoyed it more than I would have otherwise. If you know anything about my taste, then you know that I adore character-focused, emotional storytelling, with tragedy and darkness playing a big role. Character ideologies and thought-provoking themes are absolutely my type of thing as well. And all of these aspects apply to this OVA. Trust and Betrayal ticked all the right boxes for my personal tastes, and had these beautiful little touches throughout the 4 episodes to accentuate its strengths through immersion. The start to this OVA is simple but impactful. A young boy witnesses the death of his short-term guardians to a group of bandits, but is saved by a master swordsman before the evil men can finish the job. The boy is given the name Kenshin by the swordsman, and becomes his apprentice, quickly becoming adept in combat largely due to his desire to learn how to cleanse the world of the darkness he had witnessed. The story is a historical drama, loosely based on a real event called the Boshin War that happened in Japan in the 1860s. During this time, civil war was rife between the conservatives, known as the Tokugawa shogunate, and the revolutionists who opposed their rule and wished to return power to the imperial court. Kenshin eventually joins the revolutionists in a bid to replace the evil and current state of the world, and here we have the backdrop for all of the themes of betrayal, guilt, and love, the intricacies of justice and order, and more. I struggle to find many, if any, faults with the story. Perhaps it is a bit dense with historical references for anyone not familiar with the Japanese political drama in the 1800s, but I'm far from an expert on that, and I still found the story really easy to follow. Trust and Betrayal is very heavy and completely rich. It covers the conflict in Japan, but it's really about the story of Kenshin. And while some other characters, notably the enigmatic Tomoe, share the narrative burden, it really is all about Kenshin's journey. As such, this is truly a character drama. There are no wasted scenes, with each moment having a palpable weight to it, for reasons I'll explain in a bit. The pacing is absolutely spot on as well, and feels really natural. It ramps up the plot progression when it needs to, but also slows down and turns very poetic and contemplative when the story needs to breathe. Though the story does change things up a little bit and is quite variable in the types of scenes that it tackles, it maintains a distinct somber and brooding feel, drenched in the emotion established from the very beginning. Plot events occur, and like in any story, the tone shifts, but these shifts are rather like a pendulum, swinging from one type of emphasis to another, but all the while fixed on this very distinct and dark feel. In general, it's a bit hard for me to describe the atmosphere that I got from Trust and Betrayal. Throughout, it had a gloomy and ominous tone, yet one that varied in substance depending on the scenes that were occurring. A very gritty and brutal atmosphere was present in the violent action scenes that mainly dominate the first 2 episodes, but the narrative smoothly and effortlessly shifts to a more abstract and elegant type of foreboding tone in the quieter, contemplative moments, achieved through some beautiful ambient music, visual imagery, and symbolism. The more grounded and uncompromising scenes in Trust and Betrayal usually focused on the fight scenes and the violent acts committed by the shogunate. I was thoroughly impressed by these scenes. The animation was quite smooth, the framing was interesting and purposeful, and there was a realistic edge to the combat. Nothing was too fancy or elaborate, and Kenshin's style of combat was graceful, but full of ruthless efficiency. He does nothing more or less than he needs to in order to finish the job, which is something I really appreciate. Some works of fiction tend to get carried away with the choreography of fights, and forget the internal narrative behind the sword swings. Apart from these fight scenes, there are also some brutal and tragic slaughters depicted here. These struck a fine balance between being visceral and agonizing, but not over the top with the gore. The blunter and more cutthroat style of these scenes is so effective because it both introduces the watcher to the horrors of this world and establishes an emotional foundation. Through these raw, violent moments, we become invested in Kenshin and his tribulations, and this investment is what allows the quieter parts to contain such weight as we learn more about him. The quieter moments I talk about here are nothing short of beautiful, in more ways than one. In these scenes, the narrative shifts focus from the political situation and violence in Japan to explore some silent reflection from Kenshin, or more commonly, the day-to-day lives of both Kenshin and Tomoe during a relative lull in the story. Here, the dialogue and direction is focused much more lyrically on menial tasks and daily occurrences, with an emphasis on the changing of the seasons, trips to the village, and a big focus on the weather to convey a mood. But even though these tasks are peripheral to the main plot, they remain completely engaging due to the subtle character exploration and bits of development that we see in them, communicated through dialogue, tone of voice, and visuals. And since we as an audience have become so invested in Kenshin due to the more brutal story beats, these quiet moments remain just as engaging for what they mean for our characters, while allowing us to see them in a new light. All the while, these parts display an otherworldly and scattershot approach to symbolism and foreshadowing, which is consistent with the underlying darkness that this OVA is rooted in. Overall, a big reason that Trust and Betrayal works so well is because of contrast, and most of what I could find here was visual. There is subtle juxtaposition sprinkled throughout. For instance, one of my favorite examples of this was a very simple conversation scene. In it, our two primary characters, Kenshin and Tomoe, are simply walking home at dusk after a successful day of selling medicine in the market. Their conversation is relaxed and even relatively cheerful, with some cues communicating the point that both characters are starting to embrace a new way of life. But everything removed from the dialogue paints a very different picture. The two are walking along a wooded path bathed in a stark, deep red from the sunset, obviously bringing bloodshed to mind. And the music is a perfect mix of peaceful and foreboding. It's clear in this scene that despite the dialogue being pretty optimistic, there is more pain and tragedy ahead. Contrasts like this can be very effective. The relaxed and relatively happy nature of the conversation teases the viewer into a false sense of security, but the imagery and music say otherwise, begging the audience to stay wary and keeping them on edge. This foreshadowing and complex effect is so important in engaging the viewer. There was always a lingering uneasiness throughout this OVA, due in part to contrasts like this. Maybe some of this was at a subconscious level, but I could just never relax. However, while that example was just in the context of a small scene, Trust and Betrayal also addresses juxtaposition on a grander scale. The beautiful background art is offset by the horrible bloodshed that occurs in the same setting. The brutal scenes are only as gut-punching as they are because of the silent scenes, and the gorgeous contemplative story points refrain from being immaterial or boring because of the levity they provide and the weight they carry, thanks to the blunter stuff. And these scenes are supplemented by what I consider to be some of the best immersion that I've ever seen in the medium. One of the big reasons that this OVA worked so well for me was due to how lost in the story I had become. Trust and Betrayal is masterful at presentation and the little details, whether they be visual, auditory, or a combination of the two. The 4 episodes were filled to the brim with subtle little touches that didn't seem like much in the moment, but are so important in making the narrative effective in the long run. In episode 2, while entering Kenshin's room during his weary sleep, Tomoe gently hits her toe on a top on the floor. During one of the biggest story moments and the highest scale fight in the story, a firefly lights up a soldier's sword, and a member of the shogunate knocks a table off balance as he charges to begin the fight with the revolutionists. While Tomoe and Kenshin are in the market, a price tag from a fish stall gets detached and blows away in the wind. There were also some examples of these little touches in the audio design as well. Trust and Betrayal had some of the best sound effects I've ever heard in anime. The clanks of steel on steel during the sword fights were as you'd expect, but I found myself most impressed with the more mundane sound design. The sound of a roasting fire, of the bubbling inside a pan, of the little tinks of glassware and the trickle of pouring sake. The audio was pristine, down to earth, and authentic. Now obviously none of these quality little audio-visual details were needed for the story to be good, or even great. They really didn't need to be there, and were probably intended to add to the viewer experience on a subconscious level. But they stimulated my senses throughout, and gave the story a very tactile and personal element. As I've stated in my Witcher videos, I'm a big fan of little throwaway details in video games for their role in creating immersion, and unfortunately, in a lot of anime series, these don't tend to be much of a factor. But Rurouni Kenshin's Trust and Betrayal has elegance in its details. These touches are very subtle, but add their impact up, and they're much more than the sum of their parts. The more of these intricate details that were provided, the more lost in the setting and character drama I became. Because it's a story so centered on the journey of its protagonist, Trust and Betrayal really needed a strong lead, able to shoulder the intense emotional weight of the story. And if it wasn't already obvious, I believe that Kenshin is fantastic. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of his characterization, but he was the ideal type of young man to base this story and setting around. Due to his past experiences, Kenshin very understandably hates the state of the world, and wants to cleanse it. His perspective on what should be done to bring about a new and thriving Japan involves fighting fire with fire, so to say. He, along with his allies, believes that only through annihilating the enemy in battle can this corruption be pulled out from the roots for the seeds of prosperity to grow. So this is what leads to the Civil War. However, the problem here is that Kenshin is a pure and gentle soul, bordering on pacifism. If he had his way, he would just spend his days peacefully plowing the fields, planting crops, and living serenely. But the implications of this setting mean that he cannot stand by idly and watch the world continue to be ransacked, especially when he has so much emotional investment in the issue. So using the techniques he learned as a young apprentice, Kenshin becomes one of the most important members of the Uprising Party. He kills countless men, and not all of them are evil or even have the intent to hurt others. And while he puts up an emotionless front, Kenshin hates doing this, as you'd expect. But he forces himself, believing in utilitarianist ideals, with a grand vision of the happiness of the majority in mind. He's exceptional in his own right, due to his fascinating characterization and how he views and interacts with the world, but he also endeared himself to me due to his similarities with one of my favorite anime characters, Kiritsugu Emiya of Fate Zero. Maybe I'm way off base in this comparison, but I saw quite a few parallels between these men. Both are doing what has to be done with an eye on the bigger picture, and both have a cold exterior but are agonizingly hurting on the inside. Characters like this, who have ambitions to save everyone, really speak to me on an emotional level because of the meaning behind every word they speak and every action they commit. And when a character like this is done well, the investment in their character arc in the story can increase tenfold. For me, Kenshin was no exception to this, being a brilliantly executed character. From what I gather, Trust and Betrayal is quite different from the relatively more fun and light-hearted main anime series for Rurouni Kenshin, though this is just me going off of what other people have told me about the series. This OVA really is the polar opposite of a stereotypical Toonami shonen. It's a grounded and gritty historical war drama, a grim and emotionally charged tale full of beautiful moments, exceptionally executed themes, and symbolism. It probably isn't for everyone, but it was perfectly suited to my tastes, down to the littlest details. It was an elegant tapestry of tragedy, and I loved every second of it. Well guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully I've done an adequate job in communicating why Trust and Betrayal really is a great story. I'll be watching the main anime series in the future sometime, but I really am glad that I checked this one out when I did. I would definitely recommend giving it a watch if you haven't already, and if you have, let me know your thoughts on it. In the next few videos, I'll be doing a few more full series content on anime that I've recently completed and enjoyed, so keep an eye out for that. And of course, I'll be continuing with the character analysis stuff, with some more anime and Final Fantasy stuff in the works. But that's it for now. Follow me on Twitter if you're interested, add me up on my anime list if you feel inclined, or support me on Patreon if you really want to go the extra mile, though that one is definitely not necessary. Keep an eye out for more content very soon, but until then, have a great one.